Hey everyone, welcome to this episode of Perspectives. And I've been thinking a lot about why I do perspectives. It's been interesting. A lot of people have been asking me recently, why do you do it? And I do perspectives because I get a lot of joy out of having meaningful conversations with people who've put a lot of thought into their chosen topic and area of expertise. And I thoroughly enjoy that. And I can talk to anyone about any idea, but to have the opportunity to speak to people who are perhaps the best in their field, I think that's just such a pleasure and such an honor. And we get to do that on Perspectives. So I trust if you enjoy having meaty conversations and thinking about the meaning of life and pondering what it's all about, then you're enjoying Perspectives. And if you are, I'd love to hear from you. So send us a great review or refer, share this with someone or get the word out if you're loving it. We love having you. We have a great guest this week. I am going to be chatting with the author of, can you see that? I think you can. Not if you're on audio. 4,000 Weeks. I'll leave you to ponder what the 4,000 Weeks is referring to. He is an internationally acclaimed journalist and writer who is also the author of The Antidote, Happiness for People Who Can't Stand Positive Thinking, and also the author of Help, How to Become Slightly Happier and Get a Bit More Done. He wrote a column for The Guardian for over 10 years called This Column Will Change Your Life. He's recently wrapped it up. And at the end of this conversation, we talk a little bit about how he's pondering what he's going to do next with his life, being a creative and an author. What do you do when you stop doing a column for 10 years? And just, it's almost, I imagined this feeling of going into the abyss of the unknown. And his answer was terrific. He is a very devoted following to his writing on productivity, mortality, and the power of limits. One of my favorite topics right now has got to be the idea of who we are in relation to time. And I get that philosophers such as Eckhart Tolle, who we talk about in this conversation, don't believe there is time and say there is no time. It's all relative to who we are, and there are only ever unfolding moments of now. Yes, and now, how do I experience this moment of now? So Eckhart Tolle did, to me, a very spiritual version of that in his book, The Power of Now, whereas Oliver Burkeman has done a very pragmatic and philosophical perspective on how to be in the now, and really how we've escaped being in the now through busyness, overscheduling, perfectionism, the need to achieve, the hunger to get ahead, how we keep going for goals so we forget to enjoy the moment in the pursuit of that goal. And so I think both authors are talking about the same thing, but in very different ways and come at it in very different directions. He has been shortlisted for the Orwell Prize in 2006. He won the Foreign Press Association's Young Journalist of the Year Award in 2015. He won the Science Story of the Year, which is really considered the Oscar of journalism, a little while back in a piece he did on the mystery of consciousness. So these are all just like my favorite topics there can possibly be. I really trust you enjoy this conversation with Oliver as much as I did. It was very early for him in the morning in, I think, Yorkshire. If you love this, you love this podcast, you're enjoying it, and you appreciate that we have no ads, if we just give you the whole thing, then I'd love you to be part of our community. You can do that and be a part of it by subscribing and sharing the word. And here he is, Oliver Burkeman. You've written a book called 4,000 Weeks, Time and How to Use It, which I've been studiously and carefully using my time to read, as you can imagine, because of the message in the book. So let's start with a question to our viewers. How many weeks do you think on average we live? And we'll just allow a pause, and hopefully the title didn't give too much away. But I didn't necessarily connect, and I read it and the numbers were just staggering to me. So this is based on 80 years, Oliver.
Yeah.
That seems fast. Did that seem shocking, confronting to you?
Oh yeah, definitely. I just wanted to share the pain by giving the title to the book in that way. I mean, it's a little bit. There'll be some portion of people listening who are very good at mental arithmetic and who figured out that actually it's a little bit under 80 years, right? If you live to be 80, you'll have had a little bit more than 4,000 weeks. Of course, really, nobody has any idea how much they're going to get. People get quite a bit more than 4,000 sometimes. And of course, people get quite a bit less. But it never adds up to very much. Like, even if you break records for the length of a human life, it's still, when you put it in weeks, it's like 6,000 and something, you know. So there is something kind of arresting about this. What I hope is that it is not so arresting that people don't want to learn more. That would be a bad commercial decision on my part. But I think it is worth sort of driving home right at the beginning that we're talking about something very, very small in terms of.
Well, the reason I wanted to talk with you and the reason I was attracted to the book is because I spend way too much time in an existential crisis about my use of time. So where else would I go? Because I don't believe in, this is, we can break all this down into segments, but I don't believe in so much the time management philosophies of old and the overscheduling. And I don't subscribe to this idea that to be busy is to be significant, and to have a diary full and to cram to fit one more thing in is good living. And Oliver, I sometimes feel embarrassed because people say, oh, can I have a minute of your time? I know you must be so busy. And I say, no, I'm not.
Right.
I have space for this fully. This is what I want to do. And I feel embarrassed sometimes because this is the expectation that I should be so busy. But I've gone the other way. Can you speak to this? Like, have I got it all wrong? And I'm kidding with that question.
I don't think there can be a right answer for everybody about whether your time should feature lots and lots of things or fewer things. That it's just when you really stop to think about it, it's so strange that we might think having a lot to do or having a little to do was better than the other. But what we've come to believe, I think, as a culture is not only that the person with much more to do is somehow doing things better, but actually the person who feels more overwhelmed is almost doing things better or playing the game right. So it's not just having lots to do, but having a bit more to do, or maybe a lot more to do than it feels like you have the available time to do. And that is just, it's just a deeply perverse situation that is what that gets rewarded. That, if you're in a sort of, say, a corporate setting, a professional setting, and you do well and you rise up the ladder and you get paid more and your status rises, the reward for all those good things is to be even more overwhelmed than you were before, according to a lot of the research anyway. So, I know your question and the fact that it would be so bizarre to sort of tell you that it was right or wrong speaks to this notion, like, yes, there's nothing right or wrong about doing a lot of things. It depends on what the things are, right?
Yes, it does. There is so much about this I want to unpack. I did my master's on meaningful living and our relationship to what meaningful is. And I'm fascinated by the philosophers who talk about the balance between meaningful living and hedonic living. And I think if we talk about time, we can't leave out this notion of both types of well-being, the meaningfulness, eudaimonic versus the hedonistic, where it's for the pleasure. And this conflict, and to deny one or the other, means that we're fighting for a balance that is purely subjective, purely random and based on where we are in our current experience, determined mostly in hindsight.
Right, yeah.
And by how it compares when we tell the stories. So relativism also comes into it. Time is a tricky master, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think that really, what you're saying there really speaks to this notion that it is a balance, it is a trade-off. There are all these competing values and things that we can't even be sure to get right in the first place. And I think what I'm trying to say at a very sort of basic level in my book is that there's something about the quest to get this exactly right, to master time in exactly the right way, that is it's flawed to begin with. It's not just that it's really, really hard to get the balance of these things right. It's that as finite humans, we sort of have to accept that we're going to miss out on a huge amount of stuff. We're going to every time we choose to do something, we're choosing not to do a thousand other things with that hour by definition, that the kind of feeling of like, I have sorted my life out that we think we're chasing is basically not attainable. And so we get into a lot of trouble by sort of spending our lives looking for that perfect configuration, because you sort of end up missing the moment of your life completely.
You miss life.
Right.
One of the ways you describe it is finitism. Do you want to speak about what you believe finitism, which is one of the ideas you introduced early in the book?
I guess I say finitude rather than that, but finiteness, whatever they all amount.
I've done it in my head.
It all amounts to the same thing. So I don't really mind about the word we use, but the basic thought there is just that, well, that we're limited not only in the quantity of time that we have, but also in the amount of control that we can impose over how that time unfolds, over how other people are going to behave in that time, over how the projects that we launch are going to turn out or be received. We have these limits everywhere we look, and the limit of 24 hours a day and hopefully 4,000 weeks in a year in a life, those things are only the beginning, really, of the limits. But I think that something about embracing that, something about at least confronting that, entails, seeing how much effort we put into avoiding that truth in our day-to-day lives, seeing how often, to speak to a personal example, our obsessions with time management and productivity techniques, to look back at earlier parts of my adulthood, are one way to understand them at a deep level is as a form of avoidance, as a way of trying not to feel the feelings of, that come with confronting our finitude, and all the different things that we do in life. I guess this is a deep insight from sort of traditional psychoanalysis, apart from anything else, but all the different ways that we try to avoid feeling certain things that we feel like we mustn't feel, that are connected with the discomforts of being finite and limited. Yeah.
I constantly wonder with the people I coach and I work with, are they busy because they're busy, or are they busy because they're distracting themselves from the existential question of, does their life has meaning? And that can be really personal and offensive to someone. I notice this is sweeping generalization, but it's the only way we can communicate with some level of generalization and massive deletions. Yeah. That some people who are the busiest would be the most offended if it was suggested to them that them running from thing to thing to thing, it's not a judgment or a criticism, it's simply the observation. What are they not sitting with? Right, what are they not sitting in? How are they not being? Because there's a trade-off. There has to be a trade-off. If you're that busy thing to thing to thing, I've done it. That's how I started my business that I'm known for, the Coaching Institute. Busy, busy, busy. And I know doing that, I wasn't facing me. And it's been really painful and confronting and massive to allow gaps in my schedule to be and to figure out what to do with that beingness. But sometimes there seems to be a level of offense given or received, I should say, versus the busyness they have. It's almost like the more busy and the more justified they are to be busy. And again, that's not to judge anyone. If you're listening, this is super busy. I'm not coming for you. Be busy.
Yeah, no, and I think the way to avoid giving too much offense is just to say, in my case too, right? I've been there. This is me. This is not. I'm not berating other people particularly. I mean, I think how offensive that thought is will depend on the person and how good someone like you is at raising the issue. I'm sure you're more diplomatic than I would be, but the basic idea is just so human, right? Because the thing that's being escaped, or that's the attempt is being made to escape, is this is such a universal kind of response, right? And if you're getting to the point where a coach is pointing this out to you, or where you're reading a book and thinking, I wonder if this applies to me, you're already like so far along the process of self-understanding there, I think, compared to the average, because like, yeah, we are born into this crazy situation where we are limited and subject to death, and yet at the same time capable of conceiving of infinite goals and infinite possibilities with our minds. And so there's this mismatch that we desperately don't want to feel. And so, yeah, I mean, I think distracting yourself from what really matters in order to focus on things that feel better to focus on, like, it goes back to the beginning of humanity. It was noticed by the ancient Greeks and Romans, and literally every one of us still does it to some extent, right? I'm certainly not free of this pattern altogether. So all we're doing is kind of loosen that a bit and see a little bit for what it is, so that you have a bit more room for maneuver to make conscious decisions about how you're using your time.
I'm going to quote Seneca in your book, which sounds weird because I'm kind of quoting you. Nothing wrong with my eyes. Let me just stand back a bit. This space that has been granted to us rushes by so speedily and so swiftly that all save a very few find life at an end just when they are getting ready to live. This is Seneca. One of my greatest fears is the moment of my death, I face who I could have been. And so what motivates me a lot of the time, how I utilize my time, is this quote from Seneca. It's, am I filling this time? So if I look back, I'm always planning for my final year when I can't do much about it, to think I'll be okay to get there. It's almost like I'm future banking how I'm going to feel about my life.
I think that's a pretty wise tactic, as long as it doesn't bleed into something that I've definitely been subject to, which is the fear of future regret, right? Where you're constantly living in the mode of like, oh my goodness, I don't want to later on wish that I hadn't done. A little bit of that, I think, can be useful, but it can certainly go too far. Yeah. Yes,
of course. And I think that if one of the books I've been studying along with your book and prior to this book was The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle.
Yeah.
And I don't think you mentioned him in your book, but I definitely saw parallels between this idea of how present are we to this moment and your book, which you speak about that. You both have a very similar message in that you both describe the significance of planning to achieve a future goal and doing everything to achieve the future goal. And you only do it to achieve the future goal, which means you miss all now, versus being present to the process. And both of you have that very important message. And that is not an easy thing, Oliver, which I'm sure you know about. That is one of my challenges. I've got the goal and I want to run to the goal, and I know I've got to do this, this, and this. And sometimes I forget to enjoy this, this, and this.
Absolutely. And it's a flattering comparison to be sort of seen in the same, thought of in the same breath as. I think that I guess the emphasis that I try to place on it is almost a kind of negative route to that goal. This has always helped me personally with this whole challenge is not so much to kind of bear down on the question of being present, not so much to sort of dive straightforwardly into that kind of idea, but just to sort of point my attention and other people's attention to how weirdly perverse and futile it is to do the other thing all the time. Not completely, because I don't think any of us, including Eckhart Tolle, can survive or thrive without having certain kinds of goals that we're working towards. But it's that sort of total investment in that outcome to the exclusion of being present to the experience of the moment that is so damaging. And I think, for me, it's just always helped to see what's going on there, that if you are completely fixated on using time well, even though it can feel very virtuous and dutiful, right? It feels like you're being a good person. It's the kind of thing that was rewarded for most of us as kids. We were like good boys, good girls, if we were like thinking about our use of time and scheduling. If you go too far to doing that all the time, and investing completely in that use relationship, then yeah, you never get to the point at which life has its value right now, and the future never arrives, because at any moment of your life, it's always going to be that the future is in the future. So I think it's really useful to see that, because then a little bit of that sort of slightly crumbles and falls away, and it becomes a lot easier just to sort of fall back into the moment, rather than trying to kind of push yourself into the moment, if that language gets at what I'm trying to say.
Well, this takes a lot of self-awareness, I think, and consciousness. In my attempts, I would say on one day when I really gave it a shot to be present to the process and not the outcome, I would have stopped counting at over a couple of hundred distractions in a 3-hour period. And I stopped counting. It was woeful. Compared to the ideal I had in my mind, the number of distractions, the ways I convinced myself, because you write about distractions really well in the book, that needs my attention. I don't even know I'm doing it, Oliver. That needs my attention. And there I'm over there.
Right.
I need to check how that's going. And I'll just quickly, and then 3 hours is gone and the creative process has not happened. And I stopped counting, because the number of distractions, becoming aware and just consciously tuning in, is this the process that I chose for this moment? Or am I allowing my mind to take over and go to a future moment? I got distracted by the number of distractions.
Yeah, I mean, I know what you're talking about completely. I think our capacity for focusing on anything other than the thing that we thought we wanted to focus on and that we sincerely do care about the most, right? Because it's not in those moments that you secretly don't want to be completing the creative work that you're focusing on. It's exactly because you do want to focus on it that it feels uncomfortable and it feels preferable to distract yourself. So yeah, it's a very fine line, because that's obviously not ideal, and one needs a certain amount of something like self-discipline to keep recognizing what's going on and returning to the moment. But also you need this kind of infinite self-forgiveness, because it is baked into who we are that you're going to keep trying to do that. So that's why I say in the book, I think the closest thing I can offer to a solution to distraction is to give up the hope of a solution, to sort of accept that creative work and other kinds of things that matter to us a lot, that these things do trigger anxiety and fear and discomfort and sometimes boredom. And if you stop expecting it to be otherwise, then at least sometimes you can actually sink into it more readily, because you're experiencing the discomfort, but you're not layering on top of that this kind of, I shouldn't be feeling this way, I ought to be in flow, I ought to be loving every moment of this. That's just a distraction as well from sort of sinking into the moment with its mixture of pleasure and discomfort, I think.
Yes, I can see that. One of the things you talk about is procrastination, and you give an interesting reason, one of the reasons for procrastination, which is that we like the fantasy of how it will go, versus if we did it, we're probably not going to live up to that ideal, or it's not going to be as good as we imagined. The way I look at procrastination is a little different. I'm taking on board what you said, and I can add that to my repertoire. But I think procrastination can also be, it probably is fear of not being enough for the moment. The way I see it is, we don't believe we're big enough for the moment. We believe the moment's too big for us. And I think that's kind of what you're saying when you talk about procrastination. Do you want to speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think that is a contradiction. I think that's a really, really nicely put, a sort of other facet of what I'm thinking about here. What I'm trying to get at is a thing about perfectionism and overly high standards that I think we don't notice enough, and that has certainly been very illuminating for me as a sort of recovering perfectionist, which is that the kind of perfection that we're seeking very often it's structurally impossible, right? It's not that you should tell yourself, oh, it doesn't matter if this project doesn't come out quite as well as you thought, don't worry, or it doesn't matter if you can't quite meet the moment in the way you would have liked. It's that perfection, as we are subconsciously anyway aiming for it, is just not open to human beings to achieve, right? So that in the case you mentioned, bringing things into reality as opposed to the fantasy of how they might be, they will always fall short of that fantasy. It's not that you might be a bit rubbish, so they won't be quite as good as they could have been. It's that for anybody, they will fall short of the fantasy, not least because in our fantasies, we can combine with, there are no limits of time, right? I can, if I'm thinking about writing a chapter over the next couple of weeks, say, I can imagine myself doing that in the future in a way that doesn't at any point bring looking after my 4-year-old son, or being a good spouse, or getting some exercise, or I sort of, without focusing on it, I can sort of assume that I'm spending all my time on this thing. Obviously, in reality, nobody can ever spend all their time on anything. So right there at the beginning, there is this limitation that comes from trying to do this in the real world that isn't there when I'm just sort of speculating. And likewise, I can sort of have vague fantasies of the quality being perfect that don't require me to really get down to the nuts and bolts of, what word I'm going to put after what other word. And at that point, imperfection is going to enter the picture reliably every time. And so if I think that imperfection and not meeting those standards is my failing, then life is very depressing. And I'm going to beat myself up all the time for not reaching it. If I see that it's a bit like, seeking that would be a bit like seeking to make 2 + 2 add up to 5, or seeking to be able to jump 3 miles in the air or something. These are so absurdly beyond our reach that it's a huge relief. Okay, that's off the pitch, that's off the table. That ship has sailed. Now I can just spend the next hour working on this project without this burden of, are you going to achieve a particular kind of standard that is in fact totally impossible to achieve? And then you can start focusing on making it really good. Sure, I don't say it doesn't matter what the standard is, but it doesn't need to be perfect, because it is definitely not going to be perfect. I think that's what I'm trying to get at.
So your book's really asking us to be a bit more, bring more humanity and compassion to how we view ourselves. I know the book's about time, but I read it as a gentle reminder to be kinder to ourselves, that we are finite and we are facing the ultimate existential crisis, death.
Yeah,
topic. But it's true. That's the reality. The ultimate existential crisis is built into time.
Right. I think it is a question of being kinder to ourselves. I do think it depends on the personality. I imagine that, I'm just sort of guessing, that a lot of people hearing this conversation will be in the same boat as me, and from what you're saying, as you, the kind of person who has a tendency to sort of beat themselves up, to be very hard on themselves for not somehow managing to solve the built-in problems of human existence, right? And not somehow managing to be everything to all people, and to get on top of every possible demand or task. But there is another side to it, which is to sort of take more seriously and almost a little bit more sternly the challenge of this limited time we have, not to fritter it away as if we had all the time in the world. That also is me in other moments. I think these can go together. So it's a very sort of, it's a kind of attitude, I suppose. You may know much more about this kind of language than me, but it's a sort of attitude of self-friendliness, I guess, in the way that you would want for a good friend to both not beat themselves up for not doing impossible things, but you would also want that friend to, aim high for themselves, and not to sort of waste the talents and the energy and the attention that they've been gifted with. So it's it's an interesting kind of forgiveness, and sometimes a kind of tough love, I suppose, all wrapped into
What's frittering?
Frittering?
Yeah.
Oh, I mean, if you're asking me how I use that word, I'm just using it as a synonym for wasting.
I mean it philosophically.
I
Who's to
suppose,
say it's frittering?
well, that is a very good point. I think oneself is to say that. I think on some level. And I think, it's interesting. Maybe you want to push back on this, but I don't think I don't think this leads to a kind of, well, anything at all that a given person does can be meaningful, or as meaningful as anything else. I do think that there are sort of tough decisions to be made, and I think it's, I don't know. I think I fritter sometimes, for sure.
Yeah. Ultimately, if we accept no frittering, we're denying nihilism. If we accept everything can be a fritter, we're accepting everything ultimately nihilistically. What's the mid-ground? No one can define that. But there's enough research to show we need a little bit of both. We need meaningful experiences mixed in with frittering. We need a mixture of both. But I was listening to somebody talking. Do you listen to Sam Harris?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah, I was listening to Sam Harris the other day. He was speaking with the guy he has on all the time. His name escapes me. Paul Bloom, yeah. Yeah, and they were talking about literally this conversation, which is, I listened to it this morning in preparation for this conversation, because they were talking about, how do you define frittering? What is not to be taken seriously as being significant to your life? And the example they gave was very exaggerated, but I think worthwhile. This idea that, well, you can be sipping cocktails all your life, or you can be changing the world and bringing compassion and beauty and wonder. But ultimately, this is nihilistic. I realize that now I'm saying it. Ultimately, it all ends up the same way. So this is too big a question maybe, but isn't that really the question? Isn't it all without meaning? We just create a narrative around it that gives it the meaning so we can justify our very lives. This from a life coach.
I think this very quickly turns into a semantic argument that we sort of probably want to avoid too much. And it reminds me of the part of my book where I'm writing about the work of a philosopher called Ido Landau, who I've been really influenced by. And he makes this point that we should be careful or alert to the definition of meaning that we are bringing into play here. One possible response, it strikes me, to what you're saying, and I haven't heard that Harris Bloom conversation yet, but I've heard others, is like, well, why are we defining meaning as the thing that will outlive us, or that will be the thing that people will remember in a millennium's time? I think I have to go in the end for a much more intuitive sense of meaning, which I often end up talking about the work of various Jungian therapists, including James Hollis, who I quote at some length in the book. You do sort of know it when you are experiencing it, and it does have something to do with being in a place that is creative, or to do with growth, or becoming a bigger person in some way. And I can feel that when I'm engaged in some very high stakes creative or professional project, but I can totally feel that on a good day when I'm cooking a meal for my son or something, and this is what I should be doing in life. This is my appropriate role in the universe right at this moment. None of those things necessarily are going to mean anything in 100, 200 years time. But I just think it's a sort of recipe for unnecessary meanness towards oneself to use a definition of meaning that is going to rule everything out. So I suppose what I'm saying is, yes, there is some perspective of cosmic time from which writing a book and volunteering with a local social organization and just drinking cocktails all day long are all as valuable as each other. But there's another perspective from which they're not, and from which some of those mean something more than others. And then again, there is the perspective that a certain amount of cocktail drinking has a meaningful role in life, at least for many people, and that too is part of meaning. But again, not if you just did it. The fact that it's meaningful to do that for a couple of hours a week does not mean that it would be meaningful to do it all day, every day. So I guess I slightly resist these definitions of meaning that make almost anything we do meaningless, because that just isn't how we experience those activities.
It's still worth considering a nihilist perspective. I like to consider in terms of questioning how I'm utilizing the precious resource, the most precious resource there is, which is I'm alive. That's the most phenomenal thing there is. There's a researcher called Steger who I studied, and he talks about meaningfulness being about having purpose, making sense, and feeling significant. And I think if we consider how we use our time in terms of those three dimensions, we're going to create a narrative where we feel hopefully self-justifying enough that our life has meaning. Because ultimately what we're looking for is to be self-justifying. To be meaningful is totally subjective. So therefore it's self-justifying. I feel this is meaningful, therefore I feel I have meaning, I have significance. So maybe time invested in cultivating what gives us that narrative is helpful. And that can be done very consciously. But then you talk about in your book, you don't want to be too conscious about it.
Yeah.
And that's when I went and had a glass of red wine, just so you know.
Good. Yeah, excellent. I mean, I think that, I have been legitimately accused in this book of contradiction, of saying, we need to think more in this direction, but we also need to not think too much in that same direction. And I think that, I'm sure on one level, that's just a legitimate criticism of the book. But if I was to defend myself, I think what I would say is thinking that you have a complete final solution to this whole question, that you have that you figured this out and will never have to reconsider it again. That's just another version of the same issue, right? Yeah. You can try to become the total master of your time through some time management technique, or you can try to completely give that up by implementing what you think are the messages of my book, right? And in both cases, you're falling for this kind of completist, absolutist fantasy. So there's a lovely bit in one of the books by the therapist Sheldon Kopp, where he writes about seeing his role as a therapist being to wait at the door of his consulting room, metaphorically speaking, for the new client to sort of run towards him, desperately hoping that he'll sort of take them in his arms and sort everything out. And then his job is to just step back so that they fall onto their face and on the doormat of the room. There's a role, I think, for sort of declining to offer the sort of solution that doesn't exist here, and sort of seeing that, yes, we do need to think about these things some more, and yes, you can think about them too much, and yes, our relationship with time is the most important thing there is, and also, yes, if all you're thinking about is how well you're using time, you're going to fall into this exclusively future-oriented mindset. Yeah, it's all true. Yes. I don't make the rules.
One of the things I don't think you spoke about in your book, but as part of my research for this conversation, I loved this duality of research that shows there are two versions of time subjectively according to us. One is Dan Gilbert's, which is, I think it was Dan Gilbert who subscribes to experience moments, and there's Dan Kamen, who I think I pronounced his name correctly, the Nobel laureate, who's more about remembered experiences. So the second Dan K, I'll put it in the show notes exactly how to pronounce his name, everyone, because that was just terrible what I just did for a Nobel laureate. But his is about, we are gauging our lives based on how we remember it and the narrative we create around it. Whereas Dan Gilbert is more about, it's about how we experience it. I think it's probably a mixture of both, but there's a lot to be said. It doesn't matter what you do with time as long as you can create a really good narrative about it. So if we were catching up at a party when that was legal and we were chatting away, how are you going? What are you doing? If we can weave a narrative or a story around, again, this self-justification that feels good, or matters to us, we're going to feel good about sharing that story. So we're going to feel good about ourselves. And that subjectivity, I don't think, can be underestimated versus just the cold hard facts that we did good things that mattered.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if it doesn't feel like it mattered, then did it matter? I think it's a very important perspective on it. And I don't think we can sort of choose one of those two experience, those two orientations towards time. They're both there. And it brings to mind for me specifically that issue in the recollected facet of time, of how it seems to speed up as you get older, and how sort of depressing this is, right? Because it feels in recollection like the last week just went by in a flash, and then the last year didn't take much longer than that. And that's a useful clue. I think that's a useful clue to I won't go into detail about it here, but there are ways to think about sort of how to slow down that feeling of time speeding up. And it's a useful clue to the fact that there are these kind of two dimensions to how we're thinking about time, and that you can be very, very sort of hedonistically happy in the moment, but gradually building a life in the rearview mirror, as it were, that is totally dissatisfying to you. And so it's an important point to keep them both in mind. Yeah.
I can't count how many times I've come across someone, and I think I've probably done it, where they have been building their lives for the rear view mirror. I call it performative living versus substantive living. There is a performance, a show that's going on for themselves and for others, so they can appear to themselves free of pain. But the substance isn't there. And I think a lot of your book, I don't think you use this term, Oliver, but to me it's about cognitive dissonance. That pain of the gap between who we believe we are and want to see ourselves as being versus sometimes the reality. And the busyness that we've spoken about, and the performance and the worry and the rearview mirror living that many of us do, is not being able to face this cognitive dissonance, this gap between perception of self and reality of self. That's a lot to face. That gap literally sends philosophers for thousands of years talking about it. That to me is the heart of this.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add to that. I've not really expressed it in those specific terms, but I think they're excellent terms to use. Absolutely. It's about dealing with the discomfort of seeing that and feeling that dissonance. Yeah. I
was out with some people a few years ago, and the singer, I can't remember his name now, my apology, I'll put him in the show notes as well, goodness me. And he's wrote so many songs about time, Oliver, and I was loving it. I love philosophers, even poets or singers, reminding me how precious it is. And the person I was with said, I really like him, but I'm really tired of how he keeps writing about time. Like, what's the big deal? And I just saw this clash of values. Because I don't think everyone listening to this podcast will be waiting their time, as in the weightiness of it, or maybe pondering the investment in their days. I think some people really are more comfortable not tuning in the way you have. And it's not a criticism of your book. I loved it. But maybe aren't as comfortable tuning into the preciousness of time and how to build that narrative in a way that gives us meaning and joy.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of self-selecting goes on here, right? I think that if you're listening to this podcast, if you've read or are considering reading this book, my job, maybe you see this as your job too, is just to point the way a bit from maybe I'm a few hundred yards along the path further than a given person listening. I certainly don't claim to be all the way, whatever the destination might be, and that I think people sort of feel that there is something they need to be thinking about, and it's useful to sort of point the way. But absolutely, I mean, I think there are plenty of people who would far rather never think about any of these things. And I guess if you are sufficiently deeply embedded in that avoidance, maybe it's kind of fine in a way, because it doesn't trouble you that you're engaging in it. But for a lot of us, some sort of crisis comes if you do that for too long, I think enough people in the Western world that I don't know many people who aren't from the Western world, but
from watching the narrative, the media, I think plenty of people have faced that crisis in the last 18 months. I think it's been forced onto us. I think some of us have come smack bang having to face our mortality in a very real and visceral way or a philosophical way. It's either touched us because it's touched our family or someone we know, literally mortality, or the idea of our mortality has had to be brought into stark focus, even if it's simply the fact we're having to deal with 2 kids at home, a job, a boss demanding that we keep to the schedule and hand that project in time, and then our partner coming home having their own issues. That's your book. So I know you didn't write the book for these times, but you did write this book perfectly for this time, because this literally is, if we're never going to ask the question about time and our relationship with it, when do we?
Right.
When do we ask that question?
Yeah. And I can't pretend that I planned any of this.
Yes.
The pandemic is not a complicated book marketing strategy by me, and of course it has been absolutely unspeakably awful in so many ways. But I do think that it brings a perspective shift, as you say, both in very extreme terms for some people and just in a more, still in a vivid way for others, just to think about and to see the finitude of time and the decisions that they are having to make and are obliged to make. There's no way to get out of making decisions about how you apportion your time. So yeah, I agree with you. It's a really, I feel strange saying this, right? I agree with you that it's a really timely book, and I also take no credit for that whatsoever. It just came out that way. Yeah.
So many people, including myself and my husband, and so many people I know, are reevaluating where their energy flows and what's going to take up their time, and even where they're going to be based. It's, if ever anything was worth asking those questions, this pandemic makes it worthwhile. And that is in no way, I'm going to do a disclaimer now, a moral disclaimer, because I don't want to offend anyone who's actually faced losing someone through this pandemic. And it's in no way me taking into account the millions of people who don't get to have these Western versions of crises. We are incredibly fortunate that we get to have an existential crisis during a pandemic versus the reality of having to survive. So I hope that disclaimer, if anyone's listening thinking, yes, but what about? I hope I've covered enough of the what abouts to know that we are having a very privileged conversation right now about an existential crisis from a pandemic, and very fortunate that we get to do that. But for millions of people, it has raised the question, what do I want to do with the rest of my life? Do I want to commute? Is this the best way I want to create what has meaning for me? Is this the job I would be doing? Now I get to question everything. And that can be a gift and a curse. I think it's both for many people.
Yeah, couldn't have put it better myself. Absolutely. Yeah. No, I mean, there is, I can repeat what you said back to you, but I think that let's not waste people's time in that way.
Could you please speak to what you call cosmic? You call it cosmic significance, but I'm going to call it cosmic insignificance. It's in one of your chapters. I love this.
I call it cosmic insignificance too, actually. I call it cosmic insignificance therapy, which is a sort of a lighthearted way of talking about this. But I mean, it speaks to some of the things we've been discussing. I think it is surprisingly useful for a lot of people to really pay attention to how sort of irrelevant we are as individuals in the long scheme of the cosmos, of the universe, even just of the history of humanity or civilization, for a few different reasons. Some have to do with what we've been speaking about using definitions of a meaningful life that are too exacting and that rule out too many worthy activities. But the other is just because an awful lot of decisions, I think, become a lot easier to make when you realize that they are not going to sort of determine the path of the whole universe. You speak about people using this moment of the pandemic to reevaluate what they're doing with their work and their time and where they're living. That's the kind of decision that can paralyze a person, and you think, well, I'm not going to do anything that right yet because I've got to get it exactly right, and I'm completely indecisive about all the upsides of doing this, but all the downsides and all that, often built into that for a lot of people, even though they're not necessarily kind of megalomaniacs in their personalities, but for a lot of people, and certainly for me going back, is a kind of extraordinary grandiosity, right? There's a sort of unspoken assumption that it really matters to the world, to reality, which of these decisions you make, or that it will be absolutely catastrophic and terrible if you got this decision slightly wrong. And one way to get past that is to see that, like, actually the stakes are a lot lower than that. People are making these decisions every day across the world. They have been for thousands of years, and none of it makes any difference on the level of the billions of years of the existence of the universe. And that's liberating. That to me says, well, you might as well take that bold decision or that slightly risky path in life. You can sort of drop the implicit grandiosity that comes from thinking that it really desperately matters. Now, maybe not everyone thinks it really matters in the first place. Maybe there are true nihilists out there who think it doesn't matter what I do, so why do anything? I want to say it matters less what I do than I'm sometimes prone to thinking. So therefore, why not do the thrilling, exciting, courageous stuff, I guess.
Or the meaningful stuff.
Right, absolutely. Yeah.
Which can be happening too.
Yeah.
So you do talk a little bit about, just to wrap up, you do give us some little hints about how-tos, although you've studiously avoided them for much of the book.
Yeah.
Do you want to help the audience get a sense of, if they got this book, where they may be guided a little bit? Because I've got the guides here. They're fantastic. Would you like to speak to a couple of them?
Sure. I wanted to sort of, I think it's absolutely right that, as you say, that I'm trying to avoid a huge focus on tips and techniques, because I do think the perspective shift is the most important part here, and that most people are kind of smart enough, once they grasp a bit of that perspective shift, they're smart enough to come up with their own sort of what it means for their own habits and their routines. But I did want to offer a few at the end, just as pointers. And a couple of those at the beginning of that list in the appendix speak to this general notion of ways of working and of handling your tasks and your to-do lists that push you more in the direction of doing one thing at a time. So there are various different levels at which this can apply, but I'll just give one here. I think there's a lot to be said for tackling no more than one big goal or objective in each domain of your life at a time. So if your work situation permits it, that would mean working on one big important project and seeing it through to completion before you move on to the next one. And you could think of ways of applying this to, improvements you want to make to your house, or things you want to work on in your personal finances or your health. You could pick one, and even though it feels like there are 20 that are really important, you could practice the discipline of deliberately not doing anything on, 19 of those possibilities while you work on one and see it through to completion. And I think that's the reason that's so hard, is that it induces anxiety, right? It leaving those other things neglected feels bad. It feels like you're letting bad things happen. But the truth is that if you try to work on, not even 20, try to work on 5 big projects at once, all that happens is that when one becomes difficult, you bounce off to another one. So you go around constantly in a circle, never going through the challenging parts of any one project. So that's really my something I try hard to do. I'm doing it, working on a piece of writing at the moment. I'm not, I'm not going to be, you have to be realistic about it. I'm not going to like refuse to talk to you here before I finish that project. I'm not going to give zero attention to my email inbox before I've finished it, but I'm not going to move on to another big project that I know is coming down the pike, even though it would assuage my anxiety. because actually it would be part of a project to feel kind of limitless and endlessly capable that would have the reverse effect, that would lead to me making less progress on both of them. And I think that idea can be applied beyond work as well.
I think the gift in that also is getting comfortable with being discomforted. I think too many of us avoid feeling uncomfortable by switching tasks and switching attention and switching energy.
Yeah.
And the way you're doing it, by sticking at it and not having the escape hatch or the release valve on the pressure of the discomfort, we get more comfortable with discomfort and realize it's actually okay to feel uncomfortable. We can ride through it and still keep going.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is basically the whole of the subject that we've been talking about here. And it's also understanding how frequently, not always, but how frequently the discomfort that you are fearing, the discomfort that you're structuring your day to avoid, is like, it's totally copable with. If you actually go through it, it won't even feel like a big deal.
Yes.
Not a universal rule. Of course, terrible things happen, but more often than not, the sort of that thought that I can't do this because it will feel so unpleasant, it doesn't even feel mildly unpleasant when you put your mind to it.
Yes. Well done. Are you pleased with the book that you wrote?
I mean, I am. It's odd to be asked that question and odder still to reply to it, because I'm definitely someone who constantly thinks that anything I finish is not really finished and needs to be made better. But I'm after a whole bunch of responses from people, I'm finally beginning to accept that I might be onto something here. Yes, exactly.
And my other question is, did you enjoy the process? So we've talked about the outcome, which is the hitting the goal. Did you manage to sit in the process as we've discussed and enjoy it as it unfolded?
I found the process tremendously meaningful. I sort of changed as a person while I was writing this book. I think I got better as a writer. I was very deeply absorbed in it at many times. I'd say the moments that I was in sort of extreme upbeatness were the minority. I think it was more often hard than it was easy, but it was very often a good kind of hard. There were definitely the sort of, sometimes it was the moment itself. Sometimes sometimes it was that the moment itself of writing was pleasurable. Other times it was that completing little parts of it was satisfying in itself. Achieving certain insights and understanding things that I hadn't understood, I find that very satisfying. So, it was a big mix. And I think I was also probably really obnoxious to live with for certain weeks at a time in the middle of this process. It's not me you should be interviewing about that. But yeah, I think I did enjoy it as well. It's certainly, I found the process meaningful as well as the accomplishment. Yeah.
And for the viewers who don't know this, you were a contributor. You had a column with The Guardian in the UK for, I think, 10 years. And you wrote about topics like this. Did you draw on that bank? Were you walking your talk? This is a massive question to put on you as an author. Did you find yourself attempting to walk your talk, what you wrote about with The Guardian, and let it flavor where you arrived at to become an author of this book?
Yes, I would say that the way I would phrase it to myself would be they were sort of mini experiments, right? I could sort of test out ideas. I could test out modalities and techniques and ways of living in the world. And, some of them, it's really interesting to me how some columns I wrote very quickly, just almost impulsively in a way, ended up referring to sort of fundamental planks of how I think about life. And then others of them, the moment they were written, or maybe a day or two later, they were gone. I'm sure that will have been different for people reading them. It's just like, you sort of have to put all these trial and error things out into the world and see what happens.
So where are you heading? Now you're not having to put chunks of your time into writing for The Guardian. Where are you heading? Do you know, is it public yet where you're heading next, or is this just none of our business?
I would say neither of those. It's that I'm not entirely certain myself. The book was published in the English language edition in August in various places. It's now coming out in one or two other languages, and I've been doing a lot of talking and writing around the book and events and things like that. We relocated in the middle of this as a family from Brooklyn, New York, to the North York Moors in Yorkshire here in England. I write my email newsletter, which I call The Imperfectionist, once every 2 weeks. So that has all been keeping me very busy.
Yes.
But I am getting to a point now where like it's time to ask the question of exactly what this looks like next. And I'm not sure I know. I mean, I have ideas, and most of those are too vague and sort of nascent and embryonic to want to share in detail. But the real headline is like, okay, I've got to figure this out. It's like it's happening in real time. So I don't exactly know the answer to that question myself.
And I love that you're having experience of your book as we speak. You have busyness,
right?
That is finite, and then you'll have not busyness, and then you'll need to face how you feel that. I really get that. I'll call it interesting, but that can be really challenging.
Yeah, absolutely. The response to the book has given me a whole layer of new time management challenges. And at the same time, I've taken these, in concert with my wife, we've taken this decision about how we're using our time and where we're using our time. That sort of, it makes me have to sort of walk the talk. And if I'm serious about being more conscious about how I use time, like now is the moment. And you're catching me in this conversation just at the cusp of that.
Yes.
I think just at the end of the really busy part of publicity, and moving into this new unknown. Although I guess we're always moving into the unknown, so maybe it's not so strange.
As much as we try to deny it and think we have complete control over this moment, which is hilarious.
Yeah.
Is there anything else that we need to cover or you feel you'd like to speak about, Oliver?
No, I think we've covered it well. I also feel like my one consequence maybe of all this talking about my book is that my voice is sort of leaving me. So I should go and be quiet for a while right now rather than talk about more things. And
I assume that we can get, well, I already have 4,000 weeks. It's everywhere, isn't it?
It should be everywhere. Anywhere you would buy a book. Absolutely. Yeah.
And where can they follow you? I assume you're on Twitter and you have handles and things.
I am, for my sins, on Twitter at Oliver Burkeman, and my website is oliverburkeman.com, which contains all the rest and the place to sign up for the newsletter and things like that.
Perfect. You're a good man, Oliver. Thank you for coming on board. Appreciate it very much.
Thank you very much. Fascinating conversation and a challenging one sometimes, which I really appreciate. Yeah, it's brilliant.
Of course. Thank you.